Hi everyone, welcome to or welcome back to my channel. I'm Sally and this is my channel Secret Life of a Seamstress, where I love to talk all about sewing and making clothes. Thank you so much for joining me today and I hope you're doing really well. So welcome to the fourth video in my series about how to get started sewing. So I'm going to be sharing with you today some common mistakes that beginners might want to avoid, and also sharing with you a few mistakes that I made along the way so that hopefully you can avoid doing them yourself. So the first mistake is choosing a sewing pattern that's above your current skill set. So I think I was massively guilty of this. So as I've mentioned in these videos, it's really important to start with a simple pattern and work your way up. Don't make a pair of pajama bottoms and then immediately move on to something, say like a trench coat or something like that, because it just won't happen. Well, there might be those few lucky people that it does work out for, but I think 9 times out of 10, or on the whole, it's just going to end in tears. Another mistake that you might be tempted to make is skipping the pressing stage. I get it that pressing can be probably one of the most boring parts of sewing a garment. I found personally anyway that I just wanted to be sewing. Any other part of a garment making process was quite boring to me and I didn't really want to spend a lot of time on it. But now, a few years later, I've come to realise how important pressing is. Pressing not only sets your stitches and flattens down your seams, it can also be magic really. If you're fitting in a jersey neckband, for example, it can make all the difference between whether or not your jersey neckband lays flat or whether it looks all puckered and weird. I've grown to love pressing now. I actually really enjoy it because I know the difference that it can make. So if you are a beginner, don't be tempted to avoid this stage. Another step that it can be tempting to avoid is pre-washing your fabric. Another one that I was very guilty of. I'm thinking of a pair of pajamas that I sewed, which took quite a long time actually. I was really proud of them when they were finished because they took quite a lot of work. But yeah, I had unfortunately skipped the pre-washing stage with those, and the first time I washed those pajamas, they shrunk by a lot and I couldn't wear them. So since then, I've learned to always pre-wash my fabric. Pre-washing will pre-shrink your fabric and it will help avoid those nasty situations like mine, where you've spent hours on a garment, end up washing it and it shrinks and you can't wear it anymore. Another mistake that you might want to avoid as a beginner, or really at any stage of your sewing journey, is choosing the wrong fabric for your chosen sewing project. So again, another one that I was stung by. I'm recalling a time where I tried to sew a dress, which was meant to be sewn from a woven fabric from a jersey fabric. So needless to say, that project ended up in the bin. It didn't work at all. So take note of the recommended fabrics for your chosen sewing pattern and make sure that you stick to those. Of course, there are times when you're more experienced, when you can deviate from the recommended fabrics that a pattern might give you, but don't do that until you're really familiar with how a fabric is going to work with your chosen garment. And my jersey dress there didn't work out, but it did teach me quite a lot along the way. Another mistake that you might want to avoid is rushing through the prep process of garment sewing. Yep, another one that I was guilty of and still can be now, to be honest. Cutting out and pattern preparation is definitely not my most favourite part of garment sewing. But I've learned from experience how important the cutting and preparation part of sewing a garment really is. In the early days, I was guilty of thinking to myself, oh, how important can this little notch really be? Well, I will tell you, it is very important, and it's very difficult to add in once you've cut the garment, or it is in my opinion anyway. I think I had that kind of mindset where the faster I did it, the better I thought it would be, and that is absolutely not the case. These days, I really make sure that I take my time over cutting out and marking pattern pieces. And mostly these days I will actually cut and prep my pattern pieces before, or a day before, I'm planning to sew. Another thing that can be really tempting to skip or scrimp on is neglecting to cut your fabric or your pattern pieces on the grain line. So when you're cutting out your pattern pieces, you'll often have a grain line which looks like a long line with an arrow at the top and bottom. So that line needs to be matched up exactly with the selvage edges of your fabric. And this will just ensure that your garment hangs properly and that there isn't any twisting or movement that shouldn't be there in your seams. In the early days, days of my sewing, I did a short sewing course on how to make a pair of pyjamas, and I always remember the sewing teacher saying to us as a class, you'll always know when a garment hasn't been cut on the grain, because when you're ironing it, the seams won't line up. And it's surprising how many shop bought items you'll notice have this problem. But yeah, cutting on the grain just helps avoid that problem. And it will take your garment from feeling sort of homemade and not quite perfect to feeling handmade and almost couture. Another mistake that is quite common is to overlook pattern sizing. So again, one that I struggled with, I used to take my ready to wear size and I would just assume that I could cut those sizes from a sewing pattern as well. 9 times out of 10 that just won't work, because sewing patterns are sized differently to ready to wear clothes. It's always important to take note of your actual body measurements and compare them to your sewing pattern before you go in and cut your size. Another measurement you might want to consider is the finished garment measurement. And I spoke about how to do that in last week's video, so do pop over and have a look at that if you haven't already. Take time to measure your body, compare it to the pattern sizes, the body measurement sizes, and the finished garment measurement sizes. And that way you'll have the best chance of creating a really well-fitting handmade garment. Another common mistake you might want to avoid as a beginner is neglecting seam allowances. So it's really important to practice sewing accurate seam allowances. If your sewing machine has a seam allowance guide on it, then it's really important to use this. But as an example, if you think that your sewing pattern on your garment that you're sewing has a seam allowance of 1.5 centimeters, for example, if you're wobbling between 1.5 centimeters and 1 centimeter, or even out to more than 1.5 centimeters, you could be adding or losing width in your garment there, which will eventually end up creating an ill-fitting garment or something that doesn't end up being the size that it should. So if your machine doesn't have a seam allowance guide, consider adding something like a piece of washi tape onto your machine plate so that you can use that as a guide when you're sewing your seams. Another common mistake, and again one that I have been very guilty of in the past, is sewing when you're tired or angry. I was absolutely terrible at this, and I've really had to work on myself in this area. I'm very guilty of wanting to sew a garment from start to finish in a single day. I have always found it difficult, probably because I love sewing so much and I just can't wait to the end. I can't wait to get to the end and see that finished garment. But over time I've realised that that is not always the best way, and it's definitely not the best way to do your best work. So with garment sewing, there will inevitably be those moments where you make a mistake or you struggle with part of the sewing process and it gets you down and you feel tired, you feel angry, and you feel as though you just want to get to the end. In my experience, it's always best to walk away at those points, or at least have a bit of a break. Go and have a cup of tea, go and have a bar of chocolate, have a glass of wine if you need to, or perhaps not, that might make things worse. But anyway, have that break and then come back to it later on or the next day. That break will make the world of difference to your sewing because you come back fresh. In my experience, when I've tried to struggle on and sort of get through that anger, get through that tiredness and just get to the end, I know that I haven't done my best work. So if you feel yourself getting to that boiling point, or the point of tears, or the point where you feel as though you're going to throw the garment out of the window, just stop and take a breath and come back to it. Another big one, in my opinion, is failing to follow sewing instructions. So don't judge me here, but in the beginning of my sewing journey, I was actually terrible at following sewing instructions. I used to feel as though I could just go my own way and it would all work out okay. I'm going to share with you an embarrassing little example here of when I was making a dress. It was a dress with pockets and I was putting in these pockets and I couldn't quite work out how they were supposed to fit, not according to how the pattern was telling me to do it anyway. So I decided to go my own way, and I actually thought to myself, I think the pattern instructions are wrong here. I'm going to do it my own way. So needless to say, I did do it my own way and I did it wrong. I should have just trusted the process. I should have trusted the pattern instructions and I should have followed them word for word, because at that time I was a beginner. I didn't have a lot of experience in how garments were constructed and how they came together. It makes me laugh now to think about that. I think about that time a lot. I read something the other day that compared sewing instructions to GPS directions, and how if you ignore your GPS, which I think we've all probably done in the past and gone our own way, it just results in inevitably going wrong and having to come back and rely on the GPS, which knew much better than you did in the first place. Another common mistake that I think beginners are guilty of making is believing that everything that you make should be perfect. If you are a beginner, you need to give yourself the grace to make mistakes. I'm sure there are some sewists out there that make garments perfectly from the get-go, but for most of us this whole sewing thing will take time and practice and a lot of determination. In the beginning, in the early days of my sewing, there were definitely times when I would get so frustrated thinking that I was never gonna get there. Yeah, I would get very frustrated when I felt as though what I'd made wasn't perfect. But the fact is that every single garment you make will get better and better. And every mistake you make is all part of the learning process. So I am so glad that something in me made me stick to this sewing journey, because for me this is just the most rewarding hobby. I am absolutely addicted now. Not only has sewing given me a lovely handmade wardrobe, but it's also helped me with so many other things as well. It's helped me with anxiety, it's helped me with self-esteem, it's helped me with so many other things as well. So I really hope it's been helpful to go through those common mistakes that you might be tempted to make as a beginner. If you do make any of those mistakes, please don't beat yourself up about them. If you have made them already, just laugh about them like I have and move on. And there's nothing that helps you to learn more than making mistakes, in my opinion. Thanks so much for watching today, everyone. Don't forget to pop over and watch the other videos in my How to Get Started Sewing series. I'll leave them linked below. And please don't forget to subscribe to my channel and also click the notification bell so you don't miss out on any future videos. So I'll say goodbye for now, happy sewing, and I'll look forward to seeing you in another video soon. Bye.